Right. I am delighted to be joined by JT, James Townsend, founder of Kontor. JT, thanks for coming on.
Very welcome. Thanks for the invite.
So, my goal with this is to create a short series of content where we can help people unearth what it means to expand into the US. Now, I want to obviously include the Kontor story. I think we'll do that for another day where we get the whole background. But it would be good for everybody watching to get the sort of 2 minute spiel on who Kontor are and what you guys do, and then we can kind of branch into how we'll discuss the US expansion part of it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, long story short, my business partner, Luke Appleby, and I set up Kontor about 5.5 years ago. We both worked for a kind of global real estate consultancy, worked out reasonably quickly within our time of being there that tech, creative, media related businesses were massively underserved by professional services. And whether that be accounting firms, law firms, or real estate professionals, we just felt there was a bit of a market there to work with companies early stages in their growth and ultimately grow as they go through various raises and rounds of funding, and do it in a kind of slightly more digestible format and something that's a little bit more aligned to them than just day-to-day guys turning up, suited and booted, trying to tell venture-backed startups and scale-ups how to run their businesses. So yeah, it's been quite an exciting journey. We've gone from what was the two of us with a laptop and a mobile phone to now 16 staff. And as we'll kind of touch on in a minute, we've now got people out on the ground in New York as well as London here.
And you've had some great clients, so I mean, feel free to share any of those that you've worked with. But you've worked with a really good who's who of London startups as well.
We've been really fortunate. I think it's partly down to personality, it's down to network, and some of it branding as well. But ultimately, we've been really fortunate to kind of work with the likes of Monzo, for example. Taking them from 12 desks in a co-working space to a 12,000 square foot sublet, to then acquiring last year about 130,000 square feet for them in Broadgate with British Land. So that's the kind of perfect client for us. It's kind of those guys who don't have an in-house real estate function, are growing rapidly, don't necessarily want to take big long lease commitments day one because they don't know how big they're going to be in 3, 6, 12 months time, and trying to help them find a solution that matches their requirements at every given stage of their growth. So yeah, Monzo is a perfect example. WeWork, obviously, I did a lot of work for them in the first sort of 2 or 3 years of their European rollout and helped them kind of take space here in London, but also across Europe. Mixed opinions on them in terms of our clients taking space, but also a great calling card for us to go and see every major landlord in Europe and kind of say, look, here's this concept you've never heard of. It's called WeWork, but also 10 minutes at the end to kind of pitch what Kontor's about was beneficial when there was two guys, like I say, with a laptop trying to make their way. So yeah, it's been fun. And we work a lot with the VCs as well. So not only helping them find their space, so we've just done Atomico, for example, but also helping their portfolio companies find space as well.
I mean, it probably is a good time for me to give you a small plug for anybody who watches this part of the interview and is looking just for UK or London-based space. I mean, it is really worth going out and checking Kontor. But now I'll try and put a lens of your US expansion on because, yeah, as I say, my goal is that we see lots of tech companies perform well in the UK, and the natural question that follows on is international expansion and how they're going to do that. And we've seen a lot of sort of happy accidents taking place of people going out and all kind of going out and learning the same information for the first time, which probably could have been shared with them by people who've made mistakes before and can kind of feed back to them about what they would rather have not have wasted their time doing. So at some point in your journey, I mean, I assume driven by customer demand, you then decided to go and expand into the US. How long ago was that?
Really good question. It was probably 2 years ago now. When we look back from a kind of calendar specific time, we were fortunate that in the right way, hopefully, to do things, we were drawn in by our clients and their kind of appetite to expand rather than our interest and demand to actually go and kind of explore it. Because at the time we were quite a small business. We were only sort of 15, 16 people. Obviously we've had some come and go over the last sort of 6 months with COVID and everything else that's going on, but we were at sort of early stages of our scale up. Yes, New York and the US was a general interest to us and we had a fascination with it. And I've always kind of wanted to work there for a bit just to get a flavor of why it's different. But that would have been probably detrimental to the growth of our UK business if I'd gone and done it at that point. So it was kind of earmarked for 5-10 years down the road. But when you suddenly get people like Revolut coming to you and saying, "Look, guys, we've kind of worked with you briefly in the UK doing X, Y, and Z. Do you know anything about the US?" You suddenly look at the scale and how quickly they could become a big player in that local market and think, well, if we don't go with them, one of our competitors is going to do this. And it kind of evolved over 6 months or so, where more and more clients started to come out of the woodwork and said, look, we're getting to Series A, Series B. We're thinking about international expansion. We want someone to help us through that journey on the real estate side of things. Can you recommend someone, or could you do it yourselves for us? And we put out a lot of feelers as well. We started to do some sort of surveys and just said, look, if we were doing this, would you want to work with us? And it was kind of a categoric yes. So really, it was a little bit like the Richard Branson thing. It was sort of say yes and figure it out afterwards. And we ended up going down a little bit of the rabbit hole that I think most startups and scale-ups go on when they look at this, and wasted a lot of time kind of exploring things and testing things that we could have shortcutted by working with people who've been there and done it. But I also think by learning those mistakes firsthand, you do get a greater understanding of it. And we're now fortunate enough to be in a place where hopefully we can help our clients sort of shortcut a lot of those mistakes in that process by introducing them to both our partners and also having firsthand knowledge of doing it ourselves.
Right. So that first discussion post sort of saying that we are going to commit to going to the US, where did you start hunting around for? I mean, because, you're not short of office space connections, stuff like that, but it's not that simple. Did it start with an exploratory trip out there? Did you network in there and then move over and have meetings? I mean, what did you do?
Perfectly aligned it for a kind of Christmas booze trip, basically. So let's go and spend 10 days out in New York, and we'll call it a kind of information gathering exercise via each pub that we come across. But It was kind of get some boots on the ground, go and kind of figure it out, see what the local differences are compared to how things operate in the UK. We were fortunate enough from a real estate sense to have worked for a big American company prior to Kontor, and had a number of US clients who often came to me looking for UK space, but talking in kind of US real estate language. So I got a good understanding of how it operated over there and the sort of terminology. But in terms of actually kind of putting it into practice, I think that's something you only can learn firsthand. So we were fortunate to have that existing UK, US network of kind of real estate professionals to cover off the detail. But when it actually came to like, how do you set up a company? How do you employ people? What visa do I need? Where am I going to live? That was the exploration that we had to do. And we ultimately tapped up our existing network. I mean, as you know, Luke and I are sort of members of various founders networks and kind of CEO groups and everything else. And the more questions you put out there, it's often you get introduced to the most random people who you never thought you'd connect with, and suddenly you've got this sort of rabbit warren that just opens up in front of you, and you've got all kinds of people introducing you. And one of those, as you've mentioned, was the Wilson Sonsoni guys and various others within those sort of legal networks, who were great at kind of introducing us to people. Same thing with our bank, to be honest with you. We're with Silicon Valley Bank. We went to them and said, look, we're thinking about expanding to the US. You were born and bred there, if you like. They're obviously on the West Coast. But 70 to 80% of our clients are clients of theirs. So they were more than happy to make introductions, and they've been fantastic at kind of opening their black book of contacts to say, you guys should go and meet and have a chat. So there was definitely a 6 to 9 month period where Luke and I spent a bit of time. Alex, our COO, and we went over quite a bit and spent weeks on end kind of just doing meetings, just feeling it out, seeing how things worked.
And who were you typically meeting with? Was it anyone and everyone in the startup community? Was it expats? Was it VCs or just real estate brokers, etc.?
Yeah, we did a lot of work with real estate brokers who we knew, and then just got introduced to the ones where we thought in the first sort of stage of things, is there someone we could partner with here to maybe shortcut that learning process? So rather than trying to be able to do it all ourselves, could there be someone we share fees with it, who could represent our brand in the right way, or as in a partnership would get what our clients are about? And I think anyone who's worked with US real estate professionals, especially those in New York, realize they're a very different breed to what perhaps a Kontor broker is. But so that was tricky. But yeah, we also did meetings with our VC clients who had offices over in the US. We did banking partners, even personal introductions. Like one of our sort of office staff has family connections over there who are high net worth, who had a lawyer who they thought would be useful for our visa process. So it really was just about putting the message out and sort of seeing what came back. And you touched on one of the biggest things there, I think, as a Brit going over the expat network is huge. There's so much to learn from the people who've been there and done it. And they're all up for a beer and having a chat about how they've gone about it and the mistakes they've made along the way. So it is just being about open-minded, but also realizing that this is not something you can kind of plan to do week one and expect to be there week two operating it. It's quite a clunky and slow process.
And geographically speaking, if somebody wanted to land in New York, I know that Launchpad, you've just opened up a little space. Is it in Union Square?
Yeah.
But, are people talking Manhattan and that's where you're going to expect to have an office space, or are you going to be out in Brooklyn or beyond,
It's definitely, from our experience so far, the natural kind of landing point is Midtown in Manhattan. Some opt for Brooklyn, and we often find that a lot of those are led by office managers or CEOs who are moving over for a shorter period of time to say, okay, I'm going to go and then I'm going to move to Brooklyn for a year and live there, and I want something locally. And I think that's become more prevalent in the last 6 months with everything that's been going on, and not necessarily wanting to commute into the city. We have had a lot of requirements looking for sort of Dumbo and Brooklyn and all that sort of Greenpoint. But the majority, I'd say 70% of our requirements are probably Midtown and Soho. Okay. But also the other thing to note is within those requirements, we probably get 15 to 20% looking at West Coast. So they're either San Francisco or LA. But most of them are New York. And I think from a British point of view of expanding out, the majority are coming to us and saying, well, New York's sort of on a 5-hour time zone difference. We can still do our Zoom and Skype and everything else without too much disruption. A flight's 5 to 6 hours. It kind of works. Whereas you start going on the West Coast, it can get quite difficult to get meetings in, and that communication and maintaining culture, if you've got different people in different cities, can become a lot harder. So we found New York to be the natural kind of beachhead, if you like. But there are the odd firm that are looking at the West Coast specifically.
Well, and I think culturally as well, right? It seems a lot of the tech companies coming out of the UK are built out of the City of London. That and Wall Street aren't that dissimilar. We've got media tech in the UK and seem to have quite a lot of creative industries again. Ad tech, media tech. New York does that well. So it seems culturally much closer as well than when you talk about the West Coast. Now, in terms of sort of expenditure, I mean, Midtown, I mean, Manhattan's famously expensive, but would one getting an office, even a small one in New York, expect to be paying sort of similar prices to the UK, or is it quite a lot more?
Yeah, it's one of those things where you tend to look at dollar for pound on a real estate sense. It's not too dissimilar. So what I mean by that, if something's $80, it's probably 80 quid here. So you can change the pound sign for a dollar sign. You're probably about the same figure. But obviously, once you actually factor in the the exchange rate, obviously it is significantly different. The other factor that you have in New York real estate is what they call the loss factor. And that's effectively where all the landlords gather together at the beginning of the year and they say, well, this is what the net versus the gross is going to be, and this is the proportion we're going to put to it. So you actually end up paying for a lot more space that you can't use in New York. So it's a kind of false economy. But what we found with the desk pricing, which is probably more interesting from a initial stage point of view of companies moving over, where they're taking 2, 3, 10 desks in a co-working or flex provider, the rates are probably 25% more expensive, and the quality is significantly less than what you get in London, which again has been a really interesting kind of journey for us to go on. Is actually the quality's poorer, there's less of it, it's more expensive, so it's quite an eye-opener when a lot of our clients go over. They're kind of like, oh, is this all I get? It's tiny, the quality's terrible, and I'm paying twice the price for it. So again, everything costs more, even from desk pricing to your flat, to your beer, to your dinner out. Just expect it to cost probably double.
And was this something you'd initially budgeted in, do you think, when you and Luke had this conversation? You thought, we're willing to set aside X amount of money to do this? I mean, did you find that you were approximately right, or have you seen the costs to sort of be 30% more or ratchet up, etc.?
I think we anticipated it being pretty spinny, and we budgeted accordingly for getting me a visa, getting some initial space to work from, paying for a flat for a year, or sorry, an apartment, and generally having some kind of walking around money to do meetings, entertain clients, kind of just generally build a bit of a network. So I think from that point of view, we were pretty much in and around the kind of area that we thought we'd be. I think the big cost change and the surprise probably came when we tried to start employing people, and just how much salaries, for example, are significantly more expensive for people who are far more junior than what you'd get for the same price in the UK. So when you start looking at that, then factoring in the office space and trying to, keep them entertained, but certainly like private healthcare as well. You can be spending between $5,000 and $10,000 a year on an employee's private healthcare. So the cost of employment was significantly more than we budgeted for. But luckily, we've got a small team at the moment. So the thing I would caveat that with is obviously the opportunity to earn in terms of the fees that we can generate there are 2 to 3 times more than London. So as long as they're doing the work and they're doing deals, actually it kind of works out, and the profit margin stays about the same, but your revenue is significantly higher than it would be in London.
It's quite funny that from the few conversations I've had, they treat sales staff like superstars, right? So they go, if you pay B League, you get B League results. Whereas because we're not a pushy sales culture in the UK, we tend to think, I don't know, we'll train them up in what our products do or what they are, and we'll let the product do the speaking. We're not going to be pushing or kicking down doors. Whereas, A League salespeople there are real go-getters. They kind of sort of remind me of more traditional sales roles, which is why they sort of expect to be talking 6 figures immediately and then maybe more. Because someone was saying to me, they're like, if you're paying $50,000 for a salesperson, it's like, who are you hiring? Which is mad because, yeah, right, exactly. So you then had your Christmas trip out there, which sounds great, sounds lovely. And then you thought, right, we're going to do this. You then went investigating, you're speaking to law firms. Was the next challenge to sort of sort out visas and how you could be there on a sort of more semi-permanent basis?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think that's the one thing that I was surprised. The initial phase of that was quite slow in terms of trying to get the visa sorted. I have what they call an E2 visa, which is an entrepreneur's visa. Effectively means as a business owner that I'm going over there to set up. We had to set out a 5-year business plan to demonstrate the growth within the city, why we were going, and how we were hopefully going to employ local people to work in that business. So there's a little bit of front end work that needs to be done in terms of preparing that kind of business plan and justifying it. The next stage was then getting the meeting at the embassy in the UK to actually go and present that and talk them through the visa process. They just want to see that it kind of makes sense. You're going to employ some people and hopefully make some money. And it's a bit of a tick box exercise. So by the time you're actually in the interview room, it's more like, well, are you James Townsend? Are you this person who's on the passport? Are you going to make us some money? Okay, great, visa approved. Can you give me another $150 now to get a stamp in your passport? So it was an odd scenario to go through at the beginning, but once it's kind of done, you're there for 5 years. You've got that visa for that duration, and it seems that they're not necessarily checking in to see how you're getting on with that business plan, but it will probably be looked at when you get the review after 5 years to renew that visa. That being said, because we got it done up front, when we took Lizzie, who's one of our sales staff here in the UK, over to effectively head up our flex brokerage in the US and kind of start to train people, her E2 visa went through in a matter of like days. It was almost a week and a half, and then she had it. So it was efficient once you're in the system and you're up and running. It was relatively easy to sort out. So yeah, I think from the point of view of start to finish, the whole process in terms of going, right, we're definitely doing this. We want to open a company. We want to get it set up. We need to get over there and legally be on the ground to actually operate and run that business was probably 6 to 9 months after our initial kind of Christmas hunt around and a few beers.
Well, and Luke mentioned something to me, and I'm sure you'll clarify on this, that you guys were eligible for the type of visa you'd got, but there were some restrictions that can be placed on some UK companies where they won't be eligible for that. Is that right? I think something to do with the ownership structure of the company.
Yeah, it gets complicated, and it's something definitely. I know you've got future podcasts coming up with various professionals in who are more aligned to talking about this specifically. But we were told, and certainly the visa application suggested, that unless you had more than 50% of your ownership structure being British citizens, that would be an issue. So it's complicated, but I think if you're genuine about your intentions of what you're doing there, and in our circumstance, one of the founders and one of the owners of the business was effectively going there to open it and run it, it was fairly straightforward.
And throughout this process, just to kind of set people's expectations, were you continuously sort of pinging emails and questions back and forth from a legal team or an accounting team or some professional body, or can you figure out a lot of it yourself?
I mean, there's a lot written online. Certainly, the usual government websites are pretty good at covering off a lot of the kind of frequently asked questions, albeit the US ones are quite difficult to read and kind of understand, and then the UK ones can be a little bit vague. So we definitely have professionals that we worked with frequently, and we ended up spending quite a lot of money on legal fees, for example. Just one, getting the company set up, making sure we got the right accountancy practice who could cover UK and the US, and make sure we weren't making any tax issues in either kind of worse or better because of what we were doing. So we ended up setting up a company, a sort of holding company that then owned a UK entity and a US entity, and that kind of made...
Yeah, so where was that based? Was that a Delaware company?
So the US company is Delaware-based but New York registered. That's just a standard incorporated business over there, which again is a funny thing to kind of look at. It's something you can almost set up overnight, and you don't have to declare who the directors of that business are. So from a money laundering kind of perspective on company structure, it's a little bit less regulated than the UK, where you're heavily vetted before you become the director of a business here. But then when you get into bank accounts, it obviously gets a lot more complicated. And as I'm sure anyone will kind of testify to, the banking system in the US is very different to the UK. It's still, in my experience, quite old school. There's a lack of electronic and digital focus. We're seeing, for example, I wanted to rent my apartment and my landlord wanted 12 bank certified checks rather than accepting an electronic bank transfer. Now, because we're with SVB, amazing, and they've been brilliant, and they are genuinely fantastic in terms of connecting us to people and responsiveness and helping us out with queries. But they are a West Coast registered bank, and they don't have a branch in New York. They have an office, but they don't have a branch. So I can't walk into the branch of SVB in New York and get a check cut. So I ended up having to send the money for my flat basically to our attorney. Our attorney then went down the street to her Bank of America, got 12 checks cut for me, and I then handed them over physically every month to my landlord to pay my rent. It's just mental.
Yeah.
Absolutely mental.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember going to a wedding in Miami in 2016, and somebody brought out one of those things where they put the card over and they roll the print over, which was extraordinary. I couldn't believe it. But yeah, it does feel a bit different. And I imagine I'm going to speak to a lady named Megan in a future series about the sort of difference between all the states, because obviously I suspect that's the reason why getting a kind of cohesive system is challenging. But these things are really interesting anecdotes. And in terms of SVB and how they facilitate your payments between international payments, I mean, is that reasonably smooth in terms of, and do you stockpile invoices and cash in an American bank account locally, or do you just put it in SVB and they handle?
That's right. So we have the UK, we have a holding company that's registered in the UK that banks with SVB. We then have the UK side of our business, which also banks with SVB, which is a separate limited company but owned wholly by the parent holding company. And then we have a US entity, which is owned again by the holding company in the UK, but also banks with SVB. So transferring money around between the three and profits up and loans here and there to different entities is very simple for us. And we have a dedicated account manager with them as well. So nothing is particularly tricky, but I know when we originally set up, we didn't have SVB looking after the UK entity. We were with HSBC, and it was a lot harder to kind of move stuff around, and the money laundering checks that needed to go on every time we wanted to send, 10, 15 grand here to do X, Y, Z. It was always a bit of a nightmare. But by having the whole group now with one entity, it's pretty smooth. And to be honest with you, it's not that difficult. It didn't feel particularly clunky to do that side of it. I think the bigger challenge for us, really, apart from that business setup, was getting visas and doing the business plan and kind of ticking that box, and then ultimately acquiring clients to actually earn some money. The actual day-to-day operational side of it's been pretty painless.
Now, actually, just to question on to some of your clients you've worked with. So have you seen them have any issues, whether it be Revolut as they sort of look to expand office space, or hang out with expats that you've been around? Do you hear any sort of painful stories from them that you think, well, that's a good cautionary tale?
Yeah, I think a lot of them get stung early doors because they tend to say, well, look, we'll go and work with our investors. So they've given us a room in their kind of back of their office. And they often end up sort of falling out slightly. I don't know what it is. We seem to get a lot of calls from our clients about 6 months into their journey. They've been in New York, and if somebody come to us and said, look, we're working and looking for an office. And I'll say, well, where are you at the moment? They'll say, well, we're in our investor's office, but we're too noisy or we're too salesy, and we're upsetting them because they just want to crunch numbers all day and we're trying to do sales calls. And so I think there's definitely an element for me of, well, it's one of the reasons we've set up the Launchpad, right? Which is to ultimately offer space at zero cost to small groups and small teams of our clients who want to come and test the market and see if it's for them. And the idea being that they can do 3 to 6 months with us completely free. They're sitting with our team as well as other teams of people who are moving to the city for the first time. So we're all kind of learning a bunch of stuff together, but we've also got people there who can point them in the right direction when they've got questions. And it means they don't have to necessarily call in a favor by sitting in their investor's office or other partners. They're not damaging that relationship. They're figuring it out on their own without kind of causing too much grief. And then when they're at a stage where they go, okay, yeah, this is definitely going to work for us. We're starting to see some traction on the sales side of things. We need to take a 3-person office here or a 10-person office there. We then go out and find them that space. And they're kind of independent through the whole process rather than calling in favors that might necessarily damage the relationship slightly. I think there's another thing as well. Like if you're a business in your investor's office, you always feel like someone's watching you to make sure you're actually working.
Absolutely. And but that's an infinite amount of pressure, because backseat driving is the easiest thing in the world. I mean, I remember when people used to listen to my sales calls back in the early days, and you just think, well, I'm on the phone, I'm doing my best with an angle for an outcome, but it's not always going to be perfect, and it's very easy for somebody to sit there and go, you should have done this, should have happened. It's often because they're not busy enough themselves.
Yeah.
And so actually to dig further into Launchpad, I mean, you guys really are doing people a good service here. I mean, as you say, 3 to 6 months of rent-free networking. I guess you're trying to bundle the things you wish you had under one roof and to let people really sort of size it up. Will they have a PO box address that they can send their mail to if they need to start?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our personal advice is probably start for the first 6 months sending your mail to your law firm, your attorney, and have that attorney as possibly a secretary for your business. Now, it's quite an expensive PO box from that regard, but because they're opening the mail, they're scanning it in and then sending it to you, and then charging you a lawyer's fee for every 6 minutes for doing that, for the privilege. But what I would say is that if they're the company secretary, they're not going to miss key notices like tax that's due. And, again, I'll let some of the other guys kind of go into the detail around what taxes you should expect and when they're due and the penalties for not applying or kind of going with it. But if you've got someone like that sense checking everything that's coming through, you won't miss anything. And I think that's the biggest concern for the first 12 months is that we're not US experts, right? We know our product really well. We know what we want to sell, but we don't necessarily know what's due when, what tax return or what filing needs to be done. And you can easily fall into the trap of assuming it's very similar to the UK, and it's not.
It's quite scary, actually. It's quite intimidating when you look at some of the legal complications, the ability for people to sue people without having to pay the legal fees if they lose. Again, don't quote me on that. Or again, self-certified tax filings, etc. I think you can really get it wrong. And it seems to erring on the side of caution is just the best way to try and navigate it.
That's why we went down that route, and it's been good because we've moved offices a couple of times as well. And actually, we would have been getting mail to our old address, and that may not then get to where we need it to be. And I think although we can use the PO box piece and they can have their registered address in the kind of Launchpad, my kind of advice is always to look at that as a backup option. And again, like that, let's also say here, like, just to be completely clear, Kontor aren't funding this office space for potential clients. We're working with a provider who's giving us that space because they see the bigger sales pitch as well. So at the moment, for example, the Union Square space we have is with Industrious, who are quite forward thinking in terms of the approach. They understand we're a broker. We work with kind of scale up and startup businesses. They know that possibly 20 to 40% of those clients that we're sort of working with in that space may well take space with them, and that's a sales tool for them. But we tend to move the Launchpad around every 6 months to a different provider to give everyone a bit of a chance, and also for us just to freshen it up and sort of have a bit of a change of scenery. But yeah, I think it's there to be used. We're sort of hosting events there as well. We're having people come in and do regular chats. Like, it's not an accelerator or an incubator, but it is a useful tool and a kind of somewhere as a crash pad to sort of stick your laptop down for 3 hours while you're in town having a meeting and you want to go to somewhere else, and then come back in the evening at 5 o'clock, have a brief chat with a visa lawyer or a recruitment consultant who we know who can guide you through the local market, and then have a beer afterwards. So that was the idea: build a relationship, and hopefully those guys then sort of expand and like working in New York, so they'll come and take an office. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, and to that point, are you seeing generally the migration of companies from the UK to US, in your view, picking up and growing healthily, like the demand's increasing?
Yeah, one of my roles at my previous company was to work with US businesses expanding to the UK for the first time. So I've always kind of focused on that direction. So like Netflix, DocuSign, for example, Google, were all clients of mine when I was there previously. And we expected that it would be the same. But actually what we've seen over the last 2 to 3 years is a lot of the businesses, especially fintech in London, has really kind of grabbed a foothold and is, as I say, there are a lot of challenges in the US market with financial at the moment. Their product perfectly solves a lot of those headaches, and you can easily see why they would then look to the US, where there are 12 markets of more than 1 million people. There's a huge kind of capturable market for them to go and expand into. That it's an obvious next step. So when we started it, it was a small cluster of UK clients that we expected to kind of grow, and that we would grow with them, and we'd expect a few inquiries a month. What we're now starting to see is a lot of our kind of US contacts starting to come to us and use us for their next move and their next office move, which we hope will lead to the US guys then saying, well, if I'm going to go and look at London, why don't we use Kontor and go and do that? So I think over the next kind of 12 months, we should start to see some kind of reciprocal work happening, and it kind of being an even flow rather than it just being a one-way street.
Yeah. Actually, when researching for some of this interview, I sort of came across the really pithy sort of Gazette stories about failed UK celebrities trying to make it in the US, and there's this sort of delighted Schadenfreude of all the people who've just tanked trying to make their inroads in there. So it does always seem like it's just this sort of doughy-eyed desire for UK people, companies, anything to sort of just try and get a foothold into the US with variable success. I actually think it'd be quite interesting, and I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on this, but we're sort of seeing more dynamic office space usage anyway, with people talking about part-time usage or pulling some staff back. And I do wonder if then you'll be able to sort of marry the two up, where somebody looking to come over from the US into London for a little bit could take 3 months off another office where they think, well, we've got some capacity, and that wouldn't be sorry, Siri just interrupted me. Where there would be a situation where you could chop and change and switch around. a little bit and have people share office space, but internationally, not just between companies in the UK, for instance?
I think 100%. I think is the answer to that. I guess the challenges are around the legal side of it at the moment, and just occupying other people's spaces and the obligations you inherit from doing that. And the one thing I would say that in the US, where we have a market here in the UK that has traditionally been focused on leasing for 5, 10, 15 years at a time, that was not disrupted by WeWork, but certainly awoken by WeWork, in terms of being able to take something that's short-term, flexible, and at the time was considered quite design-led and interesting, as opposed to what you would see from a sort of more traditional serviced office like a Regus or an MWB. It opened up a whole other market for people to occupy space. Now, when you look at New York, yes, WeWork have 5 million square feet there, but they also have 50% of the market share. So what that tells you is there isn't a lot of competition or a lot of options. And that's ultimately led by New York being a sublet market. And it tends to be tech and kind of creative companies who will talk to their network and say, well, look, guys, we've outgrown it, or we've downsized. Do you want to come and share with us, or do you want to take this on? And the brokers make a lot of money from doing sublet deals effectively for their clients. And that ultimately, when you compare the fees to what you would get from putting someone in a flex or serviced office, are 3 times the value of what you get from that transaction. So they've been very, I wouldn't say sharky, but certainly persuasive and pushy with their clients to take a sublet and inherit all the potential bad things like broken furniture, lease liabilities, reinstatement provisions, and big rent deposits, because they get a bigger fee. And the serviced and flex market hasn't really taken off in New York in the same way that it has in London. And we see that as a huge growth opportunity, because we feel actually that people will push more for flexibility, especially given everything that's now going on. It's going to become even more prevalent. That actually that's a massive opportunity for us to kind of help push that along. And if that's driven by UK companies expanding into the US, I'm all the more for it.
That's really interesting. I'm going to tie up with a couple of quick questions to sort of get your answers on this. The toughest thing about your expansion into the US that you've experienced so far?
It's an easy one for me, actually, to be honest with you. It wouldn't be what you would expect. It's actually being away from the team. All the headache of setting up and kind of banking and moving flat and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's par for the course. You know that's coming. The thing I underestimated was that Luke and I spent 5 years building a business of people that we really love working with and we respect, and we've kind of trained and we've nurtured and we've created what I believe is a really nice culture and a nice place to work. And hopefully our clients agree that reflects in their service that they get. I missed that, being candid. I was in New York for 12 to 18 months, pretty much full time. I now go back sort of regularly, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or whatever's required, because we've got a local team there. But that 12 months, I miss the interaction with the guys and girls coming into the office every day and having that kind of banter and that energy that kind of pushes you along to get involved in things. And yeah, we had Zoom and we had Teams and everything else, and we were having regular catch-ups. But if you're on the ground by yourself trying to do every meeting, it's exhausting. You are doing the same sales pitch every hour to a different group of people. That's quite exhausting. And at the end of the day, you want to just go and have a drink and kind of decompress with somebody, and there's no one there to turn to and have that chat with. So I think, yeah, purely from a personal point of view, that was probably the hardest part.
Well, it's nice. I mean, having been in the Kontor office, it is good fun. You guys have got a really nice culture, and it's a open plan, and it's a small team. But you guys seem like you have a lot of fun. The best thing. What's the most rewarding part of it been, do you think?
Having actually had clients come both ways and take space here in the UK and the US, and ultimately give us an opportunity. I mean, like Revolut, for example, wasn't a client of ours in the UK before we started working with them in New York. But by having that relationship, finding their first space, I mean, they only took 10 desks initially, and then that very quickly grew to double the size. By having that network and kind of engagement with them in the US, we were then asked to pitch on their new move for the UK. So that's rewarding in that you're starting to see the efforts of of what we thought would happen actually come to fruition. So yeah, I think just seeing that cross pollination, let's call it that.
What's the future of the Launchpad going to be? So for in the US, what do you hope it will go on to become?
I hope it will become a recognised starting point for UK and European businesses. In the same way that there are people within our network who are the first port of call for legal, financial, and any other kind of US related inquiries, we hope that everyone will just go and see the Kontor guys. Go and take some space with them. They'll sort you out with everything. They'll connect you to their network. It's free. Why would you not do it? And ultimately expand it from something that's maybe 10 desks now to something that's 100 desks that's really kind of buzzy, and it's centrally based. And we have the same thing here in the UK and maybe even other European cities, for example.
Amazing. Well, JT, thank you so much for your time. Really helpful, and I really hope it helps some people who listen to this sort of navigate some of the issues that you've faced. And for anybody who's looking for office space either side of the Atlantic, I would highly recommend going to Kontor and checking you guys out.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Ed.